On the night of April 5, 1769, the Church of San Nazaro in Brescia, Italy, was struck by lightning. This was not, in itself, an unusual event. Churches were struck by lightning with statistical regularity in the pre-lightning rod era. Their height, their isolated positions on hilltops and town squares, and their metal fittings made them among the most reliably struck structures in any European landscape. What made San Nazaro different was what was stored in its vaults. The Republic of Venice, which governed Brescia at the time, had been using the church's basement as a munitions depot, approximately 90 tons of gunpowder. The lightning struck the tower. The spark reached the vault. The explosion that followed was heard in Milan, 100 kilometers away. 1/6 of the city of Brescia was destroyed. The church was obliterated. The death toll, estimates vary, but contemporary accounts suggest somewhere between 3,000 and 9,000 people, made it one of the deadliest single events in 18th century European history. The city had not installed lightning rods. The lightning rod had been invented 17 years earlier by Benjamin Franklin. 17 years. The technology that would have prevented the spark from reaching the vault, that would have redirected the lightning harmlessly into the ground before it ever contacted the building, had been available, documented, and demonstrated for 17 years. Brescia had not installed it, not because the technology was unavailable, not because it was expensive, not because city officials were unaware of it, because the church had said no, because the lightning rod, the metal rod, the copper wire, the grounding stake, was not merely a piece of weather equipment in the eyes of the ecclesiastical authorities of 18th century Europe. It was an insult to God. And before this story is over, you will understand how a piece of wire capable of saving tens of thousands of lives spent 30 years being banned, condemned, removed, and prosecuted across the most powerful institution in the Western world, while the buildings that refused to install it continued to burn, and the people inside them continued to die, at a rate that the technology sitting unused in Benjamin Franklin's published papers could have prevented. To understand why a lightning rod was theologically provocative, you have to understand what lightning meant before Franklin explained it. And what lightning meant, what it had meant for the entire duration of recorded human civilization, was intervention. Divine intervention. Specifically, direct divine intervention of the punitive variety. In every major religious tradition of the ancient and medieval world, lightning was not a meteorological phenomenon with a physical explanation. It was a message, a weapon. The mechanism by which the divine communicated displeasure with the human behavior occurring below the clouds. Zeus threw thunderbolts. Thor commanded thunder. The God of the Hebrew Bible sent lightning against the enemies of Israel, with a consistency documented across multiple books of Scripture. In the Christian tradition, the association between lightning and divine judgment was not a peripheral folk belief. It was embedded in the theological mainstream, reinforced by centuries of church teaching, and operative in the daily understanding of European populations at every level of education and social class. When lightning struck a building in medieval and early modern Europe, the question that every observer asked was not physical, it was moral. What did the people in that building do? The church that burned was a church that had somehow attracted divine displeasure. The house struck by lightning was a house whose occupants had, in some way that might require investigation, merited the attention of the force that controlled the sky. This was not a marginal interpretation. It was the operating framework. And into this framework, in 1752, Benjamin Franklin inserted a metal rod. Franklin's electrical experiments of the late 1740s and early 1750s are among the most consequential scientific work of the 18th century. His demonstration that lightning was an electrical phenomenon, the kite, the key, the Leyden jar, the storm, established a physical mechanism for something that had been attributed to divine agency for the entirety of human history. Lightning was not God's judgment. It was electricity seeking the path of least resistance to ground. The implications of this finding were not merely scientific. They were theological. They were political. They were, in the specific context of the Catholic Church's relationship with natural phenomena in the 18th century, genuinely dangerous to the institutional framework that had governed European intellectual life for over 1,000 years. If lightning was electricity, If it followed physical laws rather than moral ones, then the church that burned was not a church that had merited divine punishment. It was a church that happened to be tall and metal-fitted in a landscape that conducted electrical charge. The theology of lightning as judgment did not survive contact with Franklin's explanation. Not because people immediately recognized this, most did not, but because the practical implication of Franklin's physics was a device that could prevent lightning from striking a building. And if lightning could be prevented from striking a building by a human device, if human engineering could intercept a phenomenon that had been understood as divine communication, then the theology of lightning as judgment was not merely wrong, it was actionable. You could disprove it with a rod and a copper wire and a grounding stake. This was the device that the church was being asked to install on its buildings in the 1750s and 1760s. The device that said, in effect, we understand what lightning is now, and it is not what you said it was. The resistance was not uniform across Europe. It was fierce in Catholic countries, where the Church's authority over natural philosophy remained institutionally intact. It was less fierce in Protestant countries, where the Reformation had already weakened the monopoly of ecclesiastical authority over intellectual life, and where Franklin's fellow Protestants were somewhat more willing to entertain the proposition that God might use physical laws rather than direct intervention to manage the weather. In England, the lightning rod was adopted with relatively modest institutional resistance. Franklin's reputation, his membership in the Royal Society, and the Protestant intellectual tradition all smoothed the path. In France, the reception was more complicated. Franklin was celebrated in Paris, lionized, feted, treated as the exemplary figure of Enlightenment rationalism. His lightning rod was debated, discussed, and installed on some buildings. But the Church's opposition created enough friction that adoption was slower and more contested than the technology warranted. In Italy, Spain, and the Habsburg territories, the heartland of counter-Reformation Catholicism, the resistance was institutional, organized, and in some cases legally enforced. The arguments against the lightning rod were not purely theological. They assembled into a coherent, if wrong, position that drew on theology, natural philosophy, and something that sounded, if you did not examine it closely, like scientific caution. Theological argument. Lightning was God's instrument of judgment. To intercept it was to interfere with divine providence. A lightning rod was not a safety device. It was a declaration that human engineering could override God's intentions for a specific building on a specific night, and that declaration was either blasphemous or hubristic or both. Natural philosophy argument. Franklin's understanding of electricity was incomplete, which was true, and the lightning rod might attract lightning that would not otherwise have struck, making buildings more dangerous rather than less. This argument was made in good faith by some natural philosophers who genuinely doubted the physics, and in bad faith by others who found it a convenient scientific framing for a theological objection. The synthesis of these arguments produced, in several European jurisdictions, something unprecedented in the history of technology. Official prohibition. In parts of Austria and Italy, local authorities, acting under church influence, ordered lightning rods that had already been installed to be removed. In some documented cases, buildings that had survived without lightning strikes for decades before installing rods were held up as evidence that the rods were unnecessary. Buildings that were struck after installation, which happened because no lightning protection system is perfect, were held up as evidence that the rods were attracting lightning. The argument was structured to be unfalsifiable. If the building was not struck, the rod was unnecessary. If the building was struck, the rod was dangerous. No outcome was permitted to constitute evidence in favor of the technology. This is the same epistemic structure that protected Galenic medicine for 14 centuries, that protected the toothworm theory for 7,000 years, that protected the arsenic wallpaper industry's denial for 4 decades. The institution arranges its framework so that no evidence can reach the conclusion it has decided in advance is unavailable. The figure who forced the confrontation to its crisis was not a scientist or a bishop. He was a lawyer. In 1780, a lightning rod was installed on a building in Saint-Omer in northern France by a man named Charles Dominique de Vissery de Boisvallée. His neighbors, frightened by what they believed to be a device that would attract lightning to the neighborhood, complained to the local authorities. The authorities ordered the rod removed. De Vissery refused. The case went to court. De Vissery needed a lawyer. He hired a 22-year-old attorney from Arras, who had recently established a small practice and was not yet known beyond his immediate region. The attorney's name was Maximilien Robespierre. The future architect of the terror, the man who would in 12 years be sending members of the French aristocracy and clergy to the guillotine by the hundreds, made his first major public appearance arguing, in a French provincial court, for the right of a private citizen to install a lightning rod on his own property. He argued it as a case about reason against superstition, about scientific evidence against institutional authority, about the individual's right to protect himself from a natural phenomenon that the Church had declared to be beyond human interference. He won. The court ruled in favor of the lightning rod. The rod stayed. It was a local ruling in a provincial court, not a theological revolution. But it was noticed. The case was published. Franklin, still in Paris as American ambassador, wrote approvingly of the outcome. The Enlightenment press treated it as a symbolic victory of reason over ecclesiastical authority. 6 years later, Robespierre was elected to the Estates General. 9 years later, the revolution began. The lightning rod case did not cause the French Revolution, but the same intellectual framework that produced the argument for the lightning rod, the same insistence that institutional authority must yield to empirical evidence, that natural phenomena have physical rather than divine explanations, that human beings have the right to use their understanding of those explanations to protect themselves, produced the revolution. The lightning rod was not just a piece of wire. It was an argument about who had the authority to explain the world. Today, every significant building on Earth is equipped with lightning protection. The principle Franklin demonstrated in 1752, metal rod, copper conductor, ground connection, remains the foundation of every modern lightning protection system, refined by 2.5 centuries of engineering, but unchanged in its essential logic. Churches install them. The same institution that condemned Franklin's rod as an insult to God, that ordered installations removed, that arranged its epistemological framework to make the technology unfalsifiable, that institution now installs lightning rods on every building it owns, as a matter of routine maintenance, without theological commentary. The 3,000 to 9,000 people who died in Brescia on April 5, 1769, died in an explosion that a rod, a wire, and a grounding stake would have prevented. The technology existed. The decision not to use it was made by people who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were protecting something more important than the lives of the people in the buildings around them. They were protecting the explanation that lightning was God's judgment, that human engineering could not intercept divine intention, that the authority to interpret the sky belonged to the institution and not to a printer from Philadelphia who had flown a kite in a thunderstorm and arrived at a different answer. Benjamin Franklin's answer turned out to be correct. The buildings that installed his rod survived the storms that followed. The buildings that didn't, the ones where the institutional explanation outweighed the physical evidence, where the theology of judgment was more authoritative than the physics of electrical charge, those buildings burned. And the people inside them died, for an explanation that was wrong. That is the cost of deciding, in advance, which answers are permitted. It is always paid by someone other than the people who made the decision, and it is always paid in full.